The desert wind howled across the barren landscape of Arizona Territory in 1887, carrying with it whispers of a legend that would soon become reality. In the shadow of Devil's Peak, where the sun scorched the earth into cracked patterns resembling a broken heart, stood a boulder unlike any other. This wasn't just stone and mineral forged by ancient geological forces, but something far more mysterious, something that seemed to pulse with an energy that made horses refuse to approach and coyotes howl in the distance. The massive granite monolith, easily 12 feet tall and weighing what appeared to be several tons, had appeared overnight 3 months ago, as if dropped from the heavens themselves. Local Apache tribes whispered that it was a gift from the thunder spirits, while Mexican vaqueros crossed themselves and spoke of curses in hushed tones around their campfires. But it wasn't the boulder itself that drew men from across the territory like moths to a flame. It was her, the giant woman who stood beside it every dawn, her silhouette cutting an impossible figure against the crimson sky. Nearly 8 feet tall with shoulders broad as a barn door and arms that could crush a man's ribs with ease, she possessed a beauty that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Her long black hair flowed like a dark river down her back, and her eyes held depths that seemed to reflect the very soul of anyone brave enough to meet her gaze. She wore simple leather and cloth garments that somehow managed to make her appear both primitive and regal, like an ancient goddess who had stepped out of myth and into the harsh reality of the American frontier. The challenge she presented was simple in its stating but impossible in its execution. Any man who could lift the boulder and move it 10 paces would win not only a chest of gold that gleamed in the morning sun, but her hand in marriage as well. The treasure alone was worth more than most men would see in 10 lifetimes of honest work, filled with coins that bore the marks of Spanish conquistadors and nuggets of gold that seemed to capture and hold the desert sunlight. But it was the promise of claiming such an extraordinary woman that truly drove men to attempt the impossible task. 20 men had already tried and failed spectacularly. Each attempt had become a public spectacle, drawing crowds from nearby settlements who would travel for days just to witness the futile efforts. There was Big Jim Murphy from Tucson, a blacksmith whose arms were thick as tree trunks and who could bend horseshoes with his bare hands. He had approached the boulder with supreme confidence, his massive frame straining as he wrapped his arms around the stone. For nearly 10 minutes he pulled and pushed, his face turning purple with effort, veins bulging in his neck like ropes, until finally he collapsed in the dust, gasping for air and admitting defeat. The giant woman had watched his failure with neither mockery nor sympathy, simply nodding once before turning her attention back to the horizon. Then came the Hernandez brothers from New Mexico Territory, 3 men who worked in the silver mines and were famous for their ability to move boulders with nothing but ropes and determination. They had brought elaborate pulley systems and wooden levers, turning the challenge into an engineering project rather than a test of pure strength. For hours they worked under the blazing sun, sweat streaming down their faces as they applied every principle of physics they had learned through years of hard labor. The boulder remained as immovable as a mountain, mocking their efforts with its stubborn stillness. When their ropes snapped and their wooden tools splintered against the unyielding stone, they packed their equipment in silence and rode away without looking back. The failures continued with each man bringing his own approach to the seemingly impossible task. Railroad workers arrived with industrial equipment, convinced that modern machinery could accomplish what human strength could not. Cowboys came with their horses, hoping that animal power combined with human ingenuity might succeed where brute force had failed. Even a traveling strongman from a circus had made the journey, his muscles oiled and gleaming as he performed for the crowd before attempting to lift the boulder. Each failure was different, but the result remained the same. The boulder would not budge, not even a fraction of an inch, and the giant woman would simply shake her head and gesture for the next challenger to step forward. As word spread throughout the territory, the challenge became more than just a test of strength. It evolved into a symbol of something deeper, something that spoke to the very nature of what it meant to be a man in the unforgiving landscape of the American West. Saloon conversations inevitably turned to discussions of the boulder and the mysterious woman who guarded it. Some claimed she was a witch who had cursed the stone to be unmovable. Others insisted she was an angel sent to test the righteousness of men's hearts. A few whispered that she might be something far older and more dangerous, a remnant from the time when giants walked the earth and the rules that governed ordinary mortals did not apply. But legends and speculation meant nothing to Jack Sullivan, a cowboy who had ridden into the territory from parts unknown with nothing but his horse, his rifle, and a silence that seemed to weigh heavier than any burden he might carry on his shoulders. Unlike the other men who had attempted the challenge, Jack possessed no remarkable physical attributes that would suggest success where others had failed. He stood perhaps 6 feet tall with a lean build that spoke of long days in the saddle and longer nights sleeping under stars. His weathered face bore the kind of lines that came from squinting into desert sun and prairie wind, and his hands, while strong from years of rope work and horse handling, were not the massive appendages of a natural strongman. What set Jack apart was not his physical presence but something far more intangible. There was a quality to his stillness that made other men uncomfortable, a depth to his silence that suggested stories he would never tell and experiences that had shaped him in ways that couldn't be easily understood. When he spoke, which was rarely, his voice carried the weight of authority earned through hardship rather than granted through position. He had the kind of presence that made saloon fights stop mid-swing and caused even the most hardened outlaws to think twice before pushing their luck. Jack had been working a small ranch outside of Prescott when he first heard about the Boulder and the giant woman. The ranch owner, an old-timer named Pete Costello who had seen enough of life to know when something was worth paying attention to, had mentioned the challenge in passing while they were mending fence one hot afternoon. Most men would have dismissed such talk as frontier nonsense, the kind of tall tales that grew larger with each telling around campfires and in saloons. But something in the old man's voice, a note of genuine fear mixed with wonder, made Jack pause in his work and ask for more details. The story Pete told was consistent with the rumors Jack had been hearing in town, but there were additional details that others seemed reluctant to share. The giant woman never slept, Pete claimed. She stood vigil beside the boulder from sunset to sunrise, her eyes never closing, her body never showing signs of fatigue. She spoke only when necessary, and when she did, her voice carried an accent that no one could quite place, something that sounded both ancient and foreign, as if she had learned the English language from books rather than conversation. Most disturbing of all, Pete whispered, was the way the air around her seemed to shimmer sometimes, like heat waves rising from sun-baked stone, even on cool mornings when such phenomena should have been impossible. These details might have frightened another man, but they only served to deepen Jack's curiosity. There was something about the challenge that called to him in ways he couldn't fully explain, something that went beyond the promise of gold or the allure of an extraordinary woman. It was as if the boulder and its guardian represented a test he had been preparing for his entire life without realizing it. The feeling grew stronger over the following days, becoming an itch he couldn't scratch, a whisper he couldn't ignore. Finally, against Pete's worried protests, Jack saddled his horse and rode toward Devil's Peak to see the legend for himself. The first thing that struck him about the giant woman was not her size, though that was certainly impressive, but the profound loneliness that seemed to radiate from her like heat from a forge. Despite the crowds that gathered daily to watch the challenges, despite the constant attention and speculation about her nature, she stood apart in a way that went beyond physical distance. She was surrounded by people yet utterly alone, beautiful yet untouchable, powerful yet somehow vulnerable in a way that made Jack's chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. When their eyes met across the dusty space between them, something passed between them that Jack couldn't name but felt in his bones. It wasn't attraction, though she was undeniably magnificent to look upon. It wasn't fear, though her size and obvious strength were intimidating to any sensible person. It was recognition of a sort, as if two souls that had been wandering in separate wildernesses had suddenly glimpsed each other across an impossible divide. The moment lasted only seconds, but it was long enough for Jack to understand that whatever brought him to this place had very little to do with gold or glory. The current challenger, a burly miner from Colorado who had arrived that morning full of confidence and whiskey, was in the process of discovering what 19 men before him had already learned. The boulder would not move. His face was red with effort, his clothes soaked with sweat, and still the massive stone remained as fixed in place as if it had grown roots deep into the earth itself. After 15 minutes of increasingly desperate attempts, he finally admitted defeat and stumbled away, cursing under his breath about witchcraft and impossible tasks. The giant woman watched him go with the same expression she had worn for every failure, neither cruel nor kind, simply accepting of the outcome that seemed as inevitable as sunrise. Then her gaze returned to Jack, and this time she spoke directly to him, her voice carrying easily across the distance despite being pitched barely above a whisper. Her words were simple and direct, cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade through silk. She asked if he had come to try his hand at the boulder, or if he was merely another curious observer drawn by tales and rumors. Jack's response surprised everyone present, including himself. Instead of immediately accepting the challenge or making some boastful declaration about his intentions, he asked her a question that no other man had thought to pose. He wanted to know if she truly desired to be one, or if the challenge was simply a way to pass time in what appeared to be a very lonely existence. The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, drawing confused murmurs from the crowd and causing the giant woman to study Jack with new interest. Her answer, when it came, revealed depths of sadness that transformed her from mythical figure to tragic heroine in the span of a few sentences. She explained that she was bound to this place and this test by forces beyond her control, unable to leave until someone succeeded in moving the boulder but secretly hoping that no one ever would. Success would mean freedom for her, but it would also mean following whoever achieved it to whatever life he had planned, surrendering her independence to become someone else's prize rather than her own person. The gold was real, she assured him, but the promise of marriage was more complicated than it appeared. This revelation sent ripples of shock through the assembled crowd. Some men who had been considering their own attempts suddenly seemed less eager to test themselves against the immovable stone. Others argued loudly that the challenge was fair as stated and that the woman was simply trying to discourage competition. But Jack heard something else in her words, a plea for understanding that went deeper than the surface meaning of her explanation. She was trapped not just by the supernatural forces that bound her to this place, but by the very nature of the challenge itself, forced to offer herself as a prize in a contest that she neither created nor desired. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that made the desert landscape look like something from a fever dream. Most of the crowd was preparing to return to town for the night, their curiosity satisfied for the day by witnessing another failure. But Jack made no move to leave. Instead, he dismounted from his horse and began to walk slowly around the boulder, studying it from every angle with the careful attention of a man examining a puzzle that he intended to solve. The giant woman watched his careful inspection with growing interest. Unlike the other challengers who had approached the boulder with confidence born of ignorance, Jack seemed to understand that this was not simply a matter of applying sufficient force to an immovable object. He ran his hands along the surface of the stone, feeling for irregularities or weak points that might provide advantage. He examined the ground around the base, looking for signs of how deeply the boulder might be anchored or whether there were hidden obstacles that previous challengers had missed. Most importantly, he observed the woman herself, noting how she stood in relation to the boulder and whether her position or posture might provide clues about the true nature of the challenge. As twilight deepened into true darkness, the last of the spectators departed for the comfort and safety of their homes and camps. Jack remained, as did the giant woman, the two of them sharing a vigil beside the mysterious boulder as stars began to emerge in the clear desert sky. It was then, in the privacy that darkness provided, that the woman began to speak more freely about her circumstances and the forces that had brought her to this strange existence. Her name, she revealed, was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in the language of her people, though she had not spoken that tongue in longer than she cared to remember. She had not always been a giant, nor had she always been bound to guard an immovable boulder in the Arizona desert. Once, she had been an ordinary woman living an ordinary life in a place that no longer existed, transformed by tragedy and loss into something that was neither fully human nor entirely other. The boulder was not just stone but a physical manifestation of her grief, made heavy by the weight of memories she could not release and sorrows she could not bear to forget. The challenge was not truly about strength at all, she explained, but about understanding. The boulder could only be moved by someone who truly comprehended the nature of her burden and was willing to help her carry it rather than simply claim victory over it. Every man who had attempted the task had approached it as a conquest to be achieved rather than a problem to be solved collaboratively. They saw her as a prize to be won rather than a person to be helped, and that fundamental misunderstanding ensured their failure before they even laid hands on the stone. Jack listened to her story without interruption, absorbing not just the words she spoke, but the pain behind them. As she talked, he began to understand that Ayanna was not just physically isolated, but emotionally trapped by circumstances that had forced her into a role she never chose. The supernatural elements of her situation were real enough, but they were secondary to the very human experience of being reduced to an object rather than recognized as a person with her own desires and fears. When she finished speaking, Jack shared something of his own story, though he revealed far less than she had. He spoke of loss and loneliness, of choices made in desperation that had led to consequences he was still learning to live with. He talked about the way the frontier could transform people, sometimes for the better but often in ways that left them feeling more isolated than before. Most importantly, he acknowledged that he had come to the challenge not because he wanted to win her but because something in her situation had called to his own sense of displacement and searching. The conversation continued through the night, two lonely souls finding unexpected connection in the vast emptiness of the desert. As dawn approached, Jack finally stood and approached the boulder, but not with the aggressive confidence of the previous challengers. Instead, he placed his hands on the stone gently, almost reverently, as if greeting an old friend rather than confronting an enemy. He looked not at the boulder but at Ayanna, and asked if she was ready to leave this place behind, not as his prize but as his partner in whatever uncertain future lay ahead. Something changed in that moment, a shift so subtle that it might have been missed by anyone not paying close attention. The boulder, which had seemed as permanent and immovable as the mountains themselves, suddenly felt different under Jack's hands. Not lighter exactly, but somehow less anchored to its position, as if the forces that had held it in place were beginning to weaken. Ayanna felt the change too, her eyes widening with surprise and something that might have been hope. Jack began to lift, not with the straining desperation of the previous challengers but with steady, determined effort. The boulder rose slowly, inch by careful inch, as if gravity itself was reluctantly releasing its hold. Ayanna stepped forward and placed her own hands on the stone, not to help with the lifting, but to share in the moment of its release. Together, they carried the boulder the required 10 paces, moving in perfect synchronization like dancers performing a ritual that had been choreographed by fate itself. As they set the boulder down in its new position, both Jack and Ayanna felt the bonds that had held her captive snap like chains, suddenly cut by an invisible blade. She was free for the first time in longer than she could remember, no longer bound to guard the stone or wait for challengers to attempt an impossible task. The transformation was immediate and visible, her giant stature diminishing until she stood at a more normal height, though she retained the strength and dignity that had made her so imposing. The chest of gold remained where it had always been, gleaming in the morning sunlight as proof that the challenge had been real and fairly won. But neither Jack nor Ayanna seemed particularly interested in the treasure. Their attention focused instead on each other and the new possibilities that freedom had opened before them. The gold would be useful certainly, providing them with resources to build whatever life they chose to create together. But it was secondary to the deeper prize they had both discovered. As they prepared to leave Devil's Peak behind forever, Ayanna revealed the final secret of the boulder and the challenge that had defined her existence for so long. The entire test had been created by her own unconscious will, a manifestation of her belief that she could only be truly known and valued by someone who saw past the surface appearance of strength and beauty to the vulnerable person underneath. Every failed challenger had proved her point, approaching her as an object to be won rather than a person to be understood, until Jack arrived with questions instead of assumptions and offered partnership instead of conquest. They rode away from Devil's Peak together as the sun climbed higher in the desert sky, leaving behind the boulder that had once seemed so important and the crowd of curious onlookers who were just beginning to arrive for another day of witnessing the impossible. The legend would continue to grow in their absence, becoming larger and more elaborate with each telling. But the truth was simpler and more profound than any story the local population would create. Sometimes the greatest challenges in life could only be overcome by recognizing that they weren't really challenges at all, but opportunities for connection and understanding disguised as tests of strength and will. The transformation of both Jack and Ayanna continued as they traveled deeper into the territory, putting distance between themselves and the supernatural circumstances that had brought them together. With each mile they covered, Ayanna became more recognizably human, though she retained qualities that marked her as extraordinary. Her height stabilized at just over 6 feet, tall for a woman but no longer giant-like, and her strength, while still considerable, no longer seemed to violate the natural laws that governed ordinary mortals. More importantly, the profound sadness that had defined her began to lift, replaced by something that resembled hope and the possibility of happiness. Jack found himself changing as well, though his transformation was more subtle and internal. The silence that had surrounded him like armor began to soften, allowing him to speak more freely about his thoughts and feelings. The loneliness that had driven him across countless miles of frontier began to ease as he discovered that true companionship was not just possible but actually present in his daily experience. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he began to make plans that extended beyond simple survival, envisioning a future that included another person and the complications and joys that such partnership would inevitably bring. Their destination was never explicitly discussed, but they both seemed to understand that they were heading toward something new rather than returning to something old. The gold from the challenge provided them with options that neither had possessed before, the freedom to choose their path rather than simply reacting to circumstances beyond their control. They could buy land and establish a homestead, start a business in one of the growing frontier towns, or simply continue traveling until they found a place that felt like home. The specific choice mattered less than the fact that they were making it together, as equal partners in whatever adventure lay ahead. As their story spread throughout the territory, it underwent the kind of transformation that all legends experience when passed from person to person. Some versions emphasized the supernatural elements, turning Ayanna into a sorceress or spirit, and Jack into a chosen hero destined to free her from an ancient curse. Others focused on the romantic aspects, creating a tale of love conquering impossible odds that would be told around campfires for generations to come. A few kept closer to the truth, recognizing that the real miracle was not the moving of an immovable boulder, but the connection between two lonely souls who had found in each other what they had been seeking in the vast emptiness of the frontier. The boulder itself remained where Jack and Ayanna had left it. No longer possessing any supernatural properties but still serving as a landmark and curiosity for travelers passing through the area. Some claimed it still moved on its own during the dark of the moon, while others insisted it had become permanently fixed in its new position. Occasionally, other strong men would attempt to move it again, hoping to claim some reflected glory from the legend of the cowboy who had succeeded where so many others had failed. But the boulder remained just a boulder, heavy and immovable as any other large stone. Its magic departed with the woman who had unknowingly created it through the sheer force of her need and longing. Years later, when Jack and Ayanna had established themselves as respected members of a small community in Colorado, they would sometimes talk about their strange beginning and the forces that had brought them together. They never claimed to fully understand the supernatural aspects of their first meeting, but they had learned to appreciate the way that life sometimes provided exactly what was needed, even when it came disguised as something entirely different. Their love had grown from that first moment of recognition beside the boulder, deepened by shared experience and mutual respect, and strengthened by the knowledge that they had chosen each other not out of desperation or convenience but out of genuine understanding and appreciation. The chest of gold had indeed provided them with the foundation for a comfortable life, but they had used it wisely rather than extravagantly. They purchased a small ranch with good water rights and fertile soil, built a modest but sturdy home, and invested the remainder in businesses that served their growing community. Jack's skills with horses and cattle proved valuable in the developing economy of the region, while Ayanna's strength and intelligence made her a natural leader in community projects and social organizations. Together, they created the kind of life that neither had dared to imagine during their years of loneliness and wandering. Their marriage, when it finally took place, was a simple ceremony conducted by a traveling preacher in the presence of their neighbors and friends. There was no need for elaborate celebration or expensive displays, because their commitment to each other had been forged in far more demanding circumstances than any wedding could provide. They had already proved their devotion by choosing to build a life together based on mutual respect and shared values rather than convenience or social expectation. The formal ceremony was simply a public acknowledgement of a bond that had been tested by supernatural forces and found to be genuine and lasting. The legend of the boulder and the giant woman continued to grow and evolve long after Jack and Ayanna had settled into their new life. Traveling storytellers would sometimes pass through their town and tell elaborate versions of the tale, not recognizing that the real protagonists were sitting quietly in the audience, smiling at the creative liberties taken with their story. Neither felt any need to correct the embellishments or claim credit for their role in the legend, understanding that stories belong to the people who tell them as much as to those who live them. In the end, the true miracle of their story was not the moving of an immovable boulder or the transformation of a giant woman into someone of normal size. It was the much more common but no less extraordinary miracle of two people finding each other in a vast and often hostile world, recognizing something valuable in each other that others had missed, and choosing to build something lasting and meaningful together. That kind of magic required no supernatural intervention, only the courage to be vulnerable and the wisdom to see past surface appearances to the real person underneath. Their story became part of the larger mythology of the American frontier, a place where ordinary people could be transformed by extraordinary circumstances, and where the impossible sometimes became possible through sheer determination and faith. But for Jack and Ayanna, it was simply the beginning of a life they had created together, one day at a time, through choices made in love and partnership rather than in isolation and fear. The boulder had been just the beginning of their story, not its culmination, a strange and wonderful catalyst that had brought them together so they could discover what they were truly capable of achieving as partners in life's greatest adventure.